We are a protagonist, a global Britain running a truly global foreign policy. Global Britain is not a reflection of old obligations, still less a vainglorious gesture, but a necessity for the safety and prosperity of the British people in the decades ahead.
Its aim is to make the nation stronger and wealthier, a review that's been on a long and winding journey more than 4 years in the making, buffeted by Brexit, the pandemic and the election of a new US president. But now we have it.
When the term Global Britain first came about after Brexit, it was never defined, and it's important in the post-Brexit world for the UK to define where it's going, and it's important in the post-pandemic world for the UK to define where it's going. Every government is going to be wrestling with this same question because we're all in a very different position than we were a year and a half ago.
So nuclear weapons, which the government said today it may increase, are one token of power. But in truth, they can't make many more of those quickly due to problems at Aldermaston. The standout thing in this review is its commitment to invest in everything from cyberspace to actual space, artificial intelligence and robotics. It promises an £80 billion defence equipment spend over the next 4 years, but it's about more than that, using the military budget as a tool of political and industrial policy.
You're looking at space, we're looking at cyber, obviously, but we're looking also at quantum technologies, and we're looking at biotech, and these are really interesting, expensive, but important technologies going forward. They're important for defence, but they're also important for our general way of living as well.
The planned voyage east of Suez this year by the Queen Elizabeth Carrier Group is part of the tilt towards India and the Pacific. There are trade reasons for this and strengthening alliances with India, Japan and others. If there's a strategic rationale, it's about containing China, but today's paper also talks about our desire to trade and cooperate with them.
We don't yet know how China's going to evolve as a world power in terms of the rules and the norms. They're quite clearly trying to change things like the standards of the internet, the significance of human rights. But they are also a really important partner in things like climate change. And I think that handling China and British policy to China is going to be extremely difficult going forward.
Foreign aid can be one way of contesting others' influence and advancing British interests. But the government cut the aid budget this year made many unhappy. Today, it pledged to restore it when the fiscal situation allows.
I think what I need to know is that when he will do it, and I need to know that this will happen as soon as is possible, because there are a lot of people out there who are suffering in the world as a result of this cut.
The PM today insisted that the UK commitment to European security was rock solid, but Britain's forces are too small to be scattered worldwide. A carrier group can't be in 2 places at once. And the question remains whether the Americans wouldn't rather we maintain mass and focus in Europe.
I must have heard, while I was in my 3.5 years in Washington, dozens of times senior military figures say, your 80,000 standing army is too small. And I think they think these basic issues about the size of the army and basic UK capabilities are ultimately more important than sending ships, once a year into the Pacific. So that's the key for me for the future of the UK-US defence relationship.
And that concern about the size of the army speaks to choices, cutting it well below 100,000, closer to 70,000, in order to invest in those new technologies. We won't learn about those cuts until a defence paper appears next week, but the opposition is worried.
The Prime Minister has spoken of an era of retreat. He's right. In the last decade of Conservative government, defence spending and pay for the armed forces both fell in real terms.
New projects like the Tempest fighter for the Air Force will require the cutting of existing squadrons, and the Army's armoured brigades are also expected to take a blow next week. As so often, the defence budget is very taut. There are just too many projects to be financed, and that will consume a lot of this rise in defence spending. So actual cuts to jets or numbers of troops will only yield a limited amount of money to invest in those sunrise technologies like AI or cyber, which may produce only intangible benefits.
You can't always see the results of these investments, especially when, if say there's a cyber offensive attack, it may not be in the public realm at all. These investments will be increasing over the years going ahead because smaller countries and non-state actors can also play a role in this space. And so making these choices, they're not easy choices to make for governments.
So there are dilemmas on the horizon, and we'll start to learn about those next week, of cuts to ships, armour and planes taken to finance this quest for security and national advantage in a turbulent, uncertain world.
Mark Urban with that report. Well, one of the crucial elements to global Britain after Brexit is, of course, our ability to sign our own trade deals. Today, there was an interesting insight, perhaps inadvertently, into the government's thinking in this area. We're joined by our political editor, Nick Watt. Nick, what did we hear?
Well, as you say, Emily, the Brexiteers say that the UK out of the EU can now take to the seas on its own once again and sign those trade deals around the world. Mark was talking about that Indo-Pacific tilt. That means a new focus on China. And interestingly, Boris Johnson took issue with Conservative backbenchers when he said it's wrong to be talking about a new Cold War with China. That didn't go down well with some of those backbenchers. They've been rebelling against the trade bill because they want to give courts a much greater say, oversight over trade deals, because they're deeply concerned about Beijing's treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. Now, as that review was published, the HuffPost released a recording of a meeting that Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, held with his officials. And he said, look, we should be prepared to sign trade deals with countries that don't meet the standards of the European Convention on Human Rights. This is what he had to say.
So I squarely believe we ought to be trading liberally around the world. If we restrict it to countries with ECHR level standards of human rights, we're not going to do many trade deals with the growth markets of the future.
Now, the Foreign Office said that that was a distorted account of the meeting because the Foreign Secretary had said in that meeting that he could think of some countries who, on their treatment of human rights, would, as he said, put themselves beyond the pale. But what's interesting about all of this is that, yes, the UK, the upside for Brexit, as they say, is the UK can sign its own trade deals, but now the UK has to justify them on their own terms. They can't hide behind this was an EU collective decision. And on the EU's approach to trade, I think there's some in the government who say, look, let's not be naive about the EU. Germany has enormous trade with China, and just think of those French arms sales. They go far and wide.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. And so to the government. Earlier, I asked the Foreign Office Minister James Cleverly whether the nuclear non-proliferation treaty that Britain signed decades ago mattered anymore.
Well, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, of course, matters. And we should remember that the independent nuclear deterrent is and has been the cornerstone of our national defence and indeed our collective NATO defence for decades. And in a world that is less predictable and more dangerous, it's absolutely right that we maintain a credible independent nuclear deterrent, and that's what this is about.
Beatrice Finn from the Campaign Against Disarmament, Nuclear Disarmament, says we're actually, by doing this, contributing to an insecure and unstable world, that it's a 40% increase in a direction no other country has done since the height of the Cold War. It goes against international law.
The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament are hardly ever, I suspect, going to be in favour of our independent nuclear deterrent. But as I say, it has been the cornerstone of our collective defence for decades, has contributed to peace.
If you're raising your cap, you can no longer say that Britain is in favour of nuclear disarmament.
We are absolutely in favour of nuclear disarmament, but what we've always said is that unilateralism, which has been proposed by CND and others, is not the way to do this.
The biggest threat of the last year was the pandemic, and the answer, as we quickly saw, was investment in our NHS and its incredible staff. What would you say to people who simply don't understand why nurses are getting a 1% pay rise so that you can lift the cap on the number of nuclear warheads?
The NHS has received a very significant increases in funding. We're recruiting more doctors, we're recruiting more nurses. That pay rise is not just for nurses, of course, it's for all NHS staff, and I think we should be honest about that. And of course, we absolutely recognise the heroic efforts of the people in the NHS, but also with regard to our fighting of the pandemic, also to the biomedical sciences, and that combination of a fantastic National Health Service and a really innovative science base, which we're going to be investing more through the integrated review, is what has helped us develop this vaccine rollout, which is keeping people safe here in the UK and around the world.
Parliamentary law said that we would commit to 0.7% of foreign aid spending on GNI, and you have clearly made a point of our place on the international stage. Now, many people understand that in a pandemic, things change. But you have now, I understand, resolved to restore it. When will that be?
Well, we can't say for sure because we don't know how quickly we'll be able to recover from the economic impact of this completely unprecedented disease that has swept across the globe. I'm very proud. I think the whole nation should be very proud of the development work this country has done. And even though that we have been affected by this pandemic, we should be proud of the fact the UK is still, in both percentage terms and absolute terms, one of the most generous aid donating countries in the world. And we're still going to be a force for good in the world.
Your Conservative colleague Pauline Latham said we're going to be balancing the books on the back of the poor. We are devastating the amount of money that's going to Yemen and Sudan, her words. So reassure her, will it be next year that you go back to 0.7?
Well, this year we've committed to spend £10 billion.
I'm just asking when you'll get back to the law, to the parliamentary law, which was 0.7%. Will it be next year?
I can't say for sure because we don't know the duration of the economic impact of this disease. But what I also would remind you is that we are still one of the most generous aid donating countries in the world. And that's something that we should be very proud of.
Let me briefly ask you about this audio that has surfaced on the HuffPost website. Dominic Raab, your boss, recording of a Q&A with Foreign Office staff, and he says these words: "I squarely believe we ought to be trading liberally around the world. If we restrict it to countries with ECHR level standards of human rights, we're not going to do many trade deals with growth markets of the future." Is that government policy?
I wasn't on that staff meeting, and I'm not comfortable making comment on something that I haven't heard. So I don't know the context of the question. I don't know what he said immediately prior to that, immediately after that. And so without a fuller context, I'm not at all comfortable speculating about that. As I say, I'm sorry, but I wasn't on that particular staff meeting.
When it comes to China, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, would you say that it doesn't matter if these countries are below the ECHR level of human rights?
Well, the ECHR is something to which most of the world, of course, is not part. So, getting drawn into that as the sole parameter, I think it's a question that doesn't really relate to reality, because of course, the European Convention on Human Rights is a purely European thing, and we have trade relationships all around the world. As I say, I don't want to comment on that particular partial quote. It would be unfair and inappropriate for me to speculate around that.
James Cleverly, thank you very much. Thank you. Well, there's a lot to take on. Joining us now, Rory Stewart, former Conservative International Development Secretary, Michele, the former Under-Secretary of Defence for Policy under President Obama, and Peter Frankopan, Professor of Global History at Oxford University, and he gave evidence to the review itself. Welcome to all of you. There's so much to look at here, whether it's international aid, nuclear armament, China trade, or our place in the world. I think I'm going to start with Michele, if I can. What do you think from outside guide President Biden will read into this review that doesn't focus on Europe, that pivots away to Asia? Does that matter to America? Is it helpful or a hindrance?
I actually think there's a lot in the report of the review that the Biden administration will welcome. The tilt towards the Indo-Pacific as they really see China, the rise of China as a particular challenge. I think the emphasis on building up cyber capability, space capability, investing in cutting-edge defense technologies that will better prepare us to deter and prevent conflict in the future, and the doubling down on NATO. I think those will all be welcome themes in Washington, both in the administration and on Capitol Hill.
Rory, do you think these priorities are right?
This is, I think that it's sad that we seem to be moving away so much from people and from the Middle East and Africa. So I agree with what Michele said. There are things that Washington will welcome, but Washington may not be focusing so much on the small print. At the moment, the UK Army is barely got 70,000 people. It can barely hold a few thousand in the field. And if the US really asked itself where Britain's advantage lay as a partner, I think they would probably expect the UK to have the capacity to deploy people onto the ground, and that includes diplomats, that includes development workers in Africa and the Middle East. And I question whether it really makes sense for the US to have the UK just trying to mirror in a smaller way the kind of activities it's doing in the Indo-Pacific region, rather than focusing on where Britain has a lot of historical ties and a lot of expertise. So from my point of view, I think it's a clear choice. It's not the choice I would have made. I would have focused on keeping the army. I would have left the US to focus on China. I think China is rapidly growing into a situation which is very difficult for the UK to play much of a role, except as a minor partner supporting the US in, and focus on where we can really make a difference closer to home.
Peter, I'm going to bring you in a moment, but will you just respond to that, Michele? It echoes what Kim Darroch, former ambassador, said. 80,000 standing army is frankly too small, and the basic capabilities are more important to the US.
So, I do think a lot of the devil will be in the details, which we don't know yet. I understand that some of those details on where the risk will be taken, where the cuts will be made in defense are coming, next week. But I think particularly important to the United States will be the SAS and Special Operations Forces that the UK provides. Those tend to be our closest counterterrorism partners in places like the Middle East and in Africa. And so that will be very important. Also understanding what will Britain sustain as its commitments to NATO. We still have to worry about deterring Russia.
OK, Peter, let me ask you how significant a moment in our history this feels. Does it reflect what Britain is like and what Britain is capable of?
Well, I don't read this as a report that's about the US or about China. I mean, in fact, it's a pretty stark wake-up call. We've spent the last 4, 5, 6 years only really thinking about our relationship with Europe and to some extent with the United States. And although China's a big part in the subheadings in this report, really what this is telling us is what a complicated and difficult world we're facing. So the point of the integrated review was to try to find a way of producing global strategy that incorporates diplomatic, military, defense, and the kinds of very serious problems that we face. And pathogens is one of those, and the report warns that those are going to become more likely. So too extreme weather events and climate change. Also Russia, which hasn't been mentioned. And the proliferation of biological agents, nuclear warheads and so on is something which is clearly of great concern to the security of this country, coupled with cyber and new tech. So actually what this is saying is that we need to find a different way of doing business in the world. We can't just have limbs going out and saying one thing to one person and one to another. There needs to be some coordination. So that's why Dominic Raab's statement tonight is so unhelpful, because Britain is getting a reputation of saying one thing and doing another. So putting on top DFID, putting on top those cuts, putting on top, pulling back on the VSO, pulling back in other parts of the world. So it's all very well producing a report saying we're going to be more engaged and help shape the international rules-based order. It's something else to actually go about doing it properly.
So just on the Dominic Raab comments, would your sense be admit that's how trade works, that's how the world works, and we don't always demand the highest standards in human rights from those we trade with? Or would your response be to say you have to stop dealing with regimes like that?
Well, I also wasn't in a meeting that James Cleverly didn't go to.
Yeah.
So I'm only basing on what the comments I've heard on your report. But it's extremely poorly timed when we're producing a report saying we're going to build alliances with like-minded countries, we're going to safeguard rules, we're going to protect human rights, and we're going to really stand up for liberal democracy. One of the really important parts of this report says that it's just not good enough anymore to be defending the status quo. We've got to do better at explaining what the advantages and benefits are of democracy, which is in retreat around the world. You know, authoritarian regimes are doing lots of things really quite well, and we've got to work out how to respond to those, but also how to make sure that we're delivering outcomes for our citizens and for people who live here that help keep the country moving. So I think that it's a real problem to be producing a report like this and then find the Foreign Secretary saying that we should be putting money first rather than our values.
Rory, you were nodding to that, and China and Russia. Do we know what we want to do? Do we know how to do it?
That's always the fundamental problem, which is the question of can. So hidden in this report is the fact that in 2005, the British economy was larger than the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is now 7 times larger than the British economy, maybe 15 times larger within the next few years. So the big question at the heart of this report is what can we do? And one of the things that worries me when we start talking about investing in more nuclear weapons is this a good use of limited resources? And again, where I think Britain's strength is in people who speak other people's languages well, in really good development programs, in playing a role in the United Nations, and that involves getting involved with many tricky issues closer to home in the Middle East and Africa. And I think we're being tempted by an industrial strategy. That's the final thing I'd say, that a lot of this reflects Dominic Cummings's basic desire, which is to brand defense spending as a way of investing and leveling up in developing new technologies in Britain. But it doesn't reflect what I think are the real interests of UK foreign policy, which is less high technology and more about people.
Michele, I'll come back to you in a second, but Peter, can you respond to that? Does it matter if this is an industrial strategy rather than a foreign policy strategy?
Well, it's about skills. Rory's exactly right. It's about investing in people. It means sending ministers to go and visit countries that they've spent no time going to for the last decade. It's not just because of Brexit. Our footprint of what it is that our politicians do has shrunk dramatically too because of the bloodletting that's gone on in Westminster. So we need to have ministers on planes going to visit opposite numbers to discuss policy. I mean, for what it's worth, to put the kind of skills gap in context, last year there were more people at Cambridge studying Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic than there were studying Chinese. So if you want to be understanding the world, you've got to be trying to work out what's going on. And that means having soft skills, hard skills, and making the best of the competitive advantages we do have in this country, like our university system, like the education, like the culture, and working out how to use those in a way that isn't just strategic, but is in a way that gets Britain to remain safe, strong and secure and open.
Michele, does the international aid target worry you? We committed to 0.7. We know that for pandemic reasons that's being rolled back. I tried to get an answer on when that would be restored, and it wasn't clear today whether it would be in the next year, in the next 2 years, or in the next decade. Does that matter to our partners?
It does matter, and I think that is the one area where there may be some disappointment expressed in the US because development assistance is so crucial right now in terms of coming out of the pandemic, helping the poorest nations come through this alongside us, but also more broadly in terms of living our values and making sure we invest in the future. So I do think that's a point of weakness, and the US, I'm sure, will be very interested in that answer you were trying to get about when will this be corrected going forward.
We'll keep trying. Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for joining us this evening.